everyone, and it's a fabulous turnout tonight. This is the first event that is organised by a Bristol group called Remembering the Real First World War. And it's a coming together of Bristol Radical History Group and Bristol Stop the War Coalition. And they've come together to think about how to disseminate an alternative version to the kind of jingoism that we're likely to be getting about the centenary of the beginning of the First World War, both locally and nationally. The format of this evening is that we will have, first of all, we'll have our main speaker, Niall Faulkner, and then Colin Thomas will be showing a couple of short films. He's a local documentary filmmaker, and it's a couple of short films that he made as part of some work he did for TV in the 70s. He'll also be talking about some recently uncovered interesting stories locally about the First World War. And then we'll have Roger Ball, from the Remembering the First World War group locally. And then after about 8:30, we'll have a time for discussion. So questions from the floor, contributions, ideas about how to take this work forward in the next, it's not just 1 year or this year, it's the next 4 or 5 years. And then a quick rounding up at the end from members of the panel, and then you can all put lots of money in the collection boxes and go home. Well, thank you very much for coming, Niall Faulkner. Niall Faulkner tells me that he's got a foot in 2 camps. One is the archaeology camp, and the other one is the political and revolutionary camp. And it sounds like a bit of a collision at times, so it sounds like an interesting take. He's been doing a lot of work excavating First World War sites. He continues to do that work. He's doing a lot of talks about remembering the First World War, particularly in the next few months. And he's written a pamphlet, which is on sale at the back, called No Glory, which about sums it up, really. The real history of the First World War. So, Niall, thank you.
Thank you. And I mean, congratulations to the joint organisers, the Radical History Group and Bristol Stop the War, for getting such a fantastic turnout and for taking the initiative, really, in trying to get something off the ground in Bristol, because we really do need to do, I think, 4 years of campaigning as this centenary rolls out, because our rulers are choosing to use it as an ideological battleground, and I'm going to say something about that in just a moment. But I want to start by making this very simple point. If you read the letters, the diaries, the memoirs of soldiers who fought in the First World War, they don't talk very much about heroes. They talk about mud and lice and bad rations and people being torn apart and losing comrades and the camaraderie of ordinary soldiers facing the horror of modern industrialised warfare. They do that. But generally speaking, they don't talk about heroes and they don't make distinctions among themselves. And that's also reflected in our war memorials and our war cemeteries, because there was such universal revulsion against what happened between 1914 and 1918 that the rulers of Britain had no choice but to democratise the way in which they remembered the soldiers. That's not what they used to do. What they'd done in the 19th century, they dumped the bodies of working class soldiers in a pit near the battlefield, and they'd ship back the officers, and they'd end up with a brass plaque in the local parish church. They couldn't do that after the First World War because they'd killed so many, and the revulsion was so great. They had to democratise the way in which the fallen were thought about because of the radicalisation that followed the war. What our rulers now want to do, now that the last Tommy who fought in the trenches is dead, and that's just as well for our rulers, because if Harry Patch was still alive, they'd find it much more difficult to carry this argument. What they now want to do is to reconfigure the way in which we think about the First World War as a story about heroism and glory and empire. they intend to roll out round about 400 ceremonies across Britain to unveil paving stones, commemorative paving stones, which are going to be placed in prominent places in all of the hometowns of the VC winners of the First World War. Now, if that isn't an attempt to reconfigure the way we think about the First World War and turn it into a story about heroism and military glory, it's difficult to imagine what other scheme they might come up with to do that. That is part of what they are planning to do, and that is one of the things that we as anti-war campaigners, anti-war activists, anti-imperialists need to be actively involved in challenging. Why does this matter? Why does the government drive to commemorate the First World War in a particular way, to celebrate British victory, which is what some of them are saying we should do? Why does it matter that there's a raft of revisionist historians who are putting essentially pro-war arguments in relation to 1914? Why is this an argument that we need to engage with? Because, of course, history is about the present. History is always about the present. It's to do with the fact that in August of last year, they lost a vote in the House of Commons in launching an attack on Syria. Finally, after 12 years of campaigning by a mass anti-war movement, that most pathetically pale reflection of public opinion that is the House of Commons, finally, even the House of Commons voted down their proposal to start a new war. Gove was apparently absolutely livid. He was spitting abuse at the people who'd voted it down in the lobbies afterwards. And when the Tory Defence Secretary appeared on Newsnight within half an hour of the vote, he said, Iraq has poisoned the well of public opinion. The generals are supposedly fretting about the degree to which the shift in public opinion has constrained their ability in the future to project military power. Because our rulers need to be able to do that in defence of empire and profit. Because that is still about the way in which the world works. Empire and profit, the use of military power, the projection of military power to protect their interests in other parts of the world. They need the freedom to use that military power, and it's constrained by the way they've lost control over the war on terror, and the way in which the anti-war movement has risen to oppose what they're doing, tearing one society after another apart. That is a problem for them. So they want to retell the story of the First World War as a story between good empires and bad empires. People who on the one hand represent aggression and militarism, and people who on the other supposedly represent democracy and enlightenment and truth, beauty and justice. That's the story they're trying to tell us. They're saying about Germany in 1914 that Germany was an exceptionally aggressive power. They're saying about Germany that it was an exceptionally autocratic society, and they're saying that Germany was guilty of starting the war. Aggressive Germany, nasty Germany, guilty Germany. That's basically the argument in a nutshell that they're projecting. And I want to unpack that argument, but I want to make just one or two specific points in relation to it initially. Understanding why wars happen is not to do with looking at who fires the first shot. It's to do with understanding the entire context within which wars take place. And you can look at what happened in 1914 from the point of view of the British ruling class, and that's the view that's reflected by people like Michael Gove and Max Hastings. Or you can look at it from the point of view of the German ruling class. And I stress the German ruling class. I've got no truck with them, any more than I have with the ruling class in Britain. But I can see how they saw things differently in 1914. They saw themselves losing an arms race. They saw themselves being outbuilt in the Anglo-naval arms race in the run-up to the First World War. They saw the Russian army modernising on one flank and the French army getting bigger on the other flank. They felt themselves to be encircled. And they were a power that had unified late, creating a nation-state late in the 19th century, and that had industrialised late. And in the competition, because that's what it was, for markets, for raw materials, for places where you could invest your surplus capital, they found that most of the world had already been carved up. Not only were they being encircled in Europe, but most of the world had already been carved up by the British and the French, primarily. That's how Germany's rulers experienced 1914. They thought they were losing. They thought they were losing ground, and they decided to go for it in 1914 because they thought that a war was coming. That's not to justify it. It's just to explain it. It's to explain that this is part of an insane system. Let's try and unpack it now in a more sophisticated way. Because there are really always two ways of looking at history. You can look at history from above. We'll start with that, and then we'll look at it in a different way. I'll tell you what you see if you look at it from above in 1914. In one place you see a group of bankers and industrialists and arms manufacturers and generals and admirals gathered around a German cross. And then you pan across and you see another group of the same sort of people, bankers and industrialists and arms manufacturers and generals and admirals, and they're gathered around a French tricolour. And then you pan across again, and you see another bunch of the same sort of people, and they're gathered around a Union Jack. And they're all competing with each other, because they've created a mad world based on competition. A world divided into competing corporations, competing industrial corporations, competing financial corporations, a world divided into competing nation-states, a world divided into competing empires. And they are competing with each other for access to raw materials, for markets for the goods which their factories are producing, for contracts to build railways, for places to which they can sell their armaments, for opportunities to export capital, in order to continue to accumulate wealth, in order to continue to make profit. And because of that competition, they had, in the course of about 40 years, divided up almost the whole of Africa. It was called the Scramble for Africa. In 1870, about 10% of Africa was ruled by Europeans. By the time of the First World War, more than 90% of Africa was ruled by Europeans. And it was because that struggle for empire had exhausted the potential that the war or the conflict, the tension, returned to Europe and turned into an arms race, and then exploded in 1914. And fundamentally what it was in 1914 was a war to decide which group of immensely rich people would get even richer at the expense of which other group in a war for empire and profit. That's what it was about. That's one way of looking at the world, from above. And of course there's another way. You can look at it from below. And if you look at it from below, it always looks very different. Being down in the shit looking up is very different from being up there with the elite, with the rich, with the bankers, with the industrialists. And if you are a Welsh miner on strike against poverty, wages and the slum in which you're condemned to live your life, the enemy is not a German miner sent into the trenches. The enemy is the mine boss. And the same is true if you're a German miner in the Ruhr. Your enemy is the mine boss. And the same is true if you're a Czech miner in Bohemia. And the same is true if you're a Russian miner in the Donbass. And the same is true right the way across Europe for working people. For working people, The enemy is at home. Very often, in 1914, you could see the enemy's mansion on the hill, because very often the bosses lived cheek by jowl with the workers they exploited. If you're a suffragette in 1914, the enemy's not the Kaiser. At least if you're a British suffragette, it's not. If you're a German woman fighting for the right to vote, then admittedly the Kaiser is the enemy. But if you're a British woman fighting for the right to vote, the enemy is the British government, the Liberal government that denies the right to vote to women. If you're Irish, the enemy is the British Empire, not the German Empire. If you're Egyptian, living under British rule, the enemy is the British Empire. If you're an Indian, if you're one of the 300 million people living under British rule in India, the enemy is the British Empire. 1 in 4 people on the planet had as their main enemy the British Empire, because that's how much the British had grabbed. They controlled 1/5 of the world's land surface and 1/4 of the world's people in 1914. So if you're down at the bottom, you experience the world in a very, very different way, and your enemy is not the enemy that your rulers tell you should be fighting. And that's why the First World War was contested. And we have to tease out that contested history of the First World War that they want to deny. It was contested before it started. There were hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Europe protesting against war in the July crisis of 1914. It's estimated that there were 750,000 demonstrators on the streets of German cities alone in the course of the July crisis in 1914. There had been resolution after resolution after resolution passed at Socialist Party conferences, at trade union conferences, at meetings of the Socialist International, condemning war, warning about war, saying there would be mass action, there would be calls for mass action in the event of war. We might want to have a discussion about why that was not delivered upon. Suffice it to say, the anti-war opinion was massive. Tens of millions of people across Europe were opposed to war. Now, we know there's a wave of jingoism when the war breaks out. We know that in 1914, nationalism, often tinged with racism, is used to suppress, is used to flatten the anti-war mood, is used to flatten the socialist movement. We know that. We know that initially the ruling class is able to achieve that sea change, apparent sea change, almost overnight in public opinion. War has that effect because it has its own logic, it has its own ideology. But some, on our side, on the side of working people, did not succumb. And they faced the abuse. They faced the often physical abuse. They faced very often imprisonment. Occasionally, their health was destroyed and sometimes they were killed because they were a small, beleaguered minority of people opposing the war when it was very, very hard to oppose the war, and in that way keeping the flag flying. And that mattered. Because in time, of course, the experience of modern industrialised slaughter in the trenches and the privation at home meant that opinion began to shift. And that was going on steadily, all the time. The mole of history was at work through the long years of the war. The mole of history suddenly surfaced in Christmas 1914, when along the front line, and it was massive, the scale of it, the Christmas truce, along the front line, the British soldiers and the German soldiers stopped fighting each other. They estimate that 2/3 of the British line was affected by the Christmas truce. This was a huge fraternisation of ordinary soldiers. The mole of history momentarily raised his head and then disappeared again. But he's working. And in 1917, it explodes. It explodes in a wave of militancy both among soldiers, a wave of mutinies in the French army, for example, a collapse of the Italian army on the battlefront at the end of 1917, and of course, the explosion of revolution in Russia, as hundreds of thousands of peasant conscript soldiers refuse to fight, climb out of the trenches, head for home, shoot down the officers who try and stop them. And then in 1918, the war having been stopped on the Eastern Front by the mass action of workers and soldiers, the war is shut down on the Western Front by the eruption of the German Revolution. And the sequence is this. The Germans were losing. The Germans were being pushed back on the Western Front. But the key thing was the morale of the German army. Could they keep the German army fighting in the trenches? What tipped it? What made it decisive that they could not rely on being able to do that was the revolution which started in Kiel, when the sailors of the German High Seas Fleet refused to put to sea. And the way in which that revolution spread from Kiel across the cities of Germany, so that the red flags went up right the way across Germany, including Berlin, the capital. That's before the armistice. And it's that that persuades the German generals. They have to make peace. It's that that means that the Kaiser is forced to abdicate, and that the armistice is agreed on the 11th of November 1918. Revolution shut down the First World War on the Eastern Front, and then it shut down the First World War on the Western Front. It was a great revolt of ordinary working people, some in uniform, some at home, against the horrors of what had happened between 1914 and 1918 that brought it to an end. We must tell that story. We must tell the story that says what the rulers of the world did between 1914 and 1918 was create a world gone mad. Anybody who thinks that what happened between 1914 and 1918, when the products of human labour were turned into a vast mechanism for the destruction of life, killing some 15 million people. Anybody who thinks that that is part of any kind of rational world order has to be insane. That is, by any definition, a world gone mad. And it went mad because the system was dysfunctional. A system divided into competing corporations, divided into competing nation states, divided into competing empires, as the world still is. That is dysfunctional. It does not conform to human need. It creates a situation where the products of our collective labour are sometimes turned into a monstrous mechanism of destruction by our rulers that tears societies apart in a way that has happened again and again and again since the first fully industrialised war began in 1914. We have to project that argument. We have to project the argument that because of that, the war was contested at the time and ultimately it was defeated by a revolt of ordinary people, and we have to assert that argument through the 4 years of the centenary so that our rulers do not recover their confidence and their capacity to project military power across the world and tear other societies apart in the period ahead, which is their intention.
Is going to show us two short films. He will introduce himself.
Indeed. Thank you, Liz. The summer of 1914 was remembered as an especially beautiful one, and reading about that period before the First World War in this book, an account of the Labour and Socialist movement in Bristol, published 80 years ago, it all seems very far away indeed. Apparently, left-wing hikers and bikers used to pedal off, stride off into the countryside, where Tea was partaken of at a pre-arranged beauty spot. A choir delighted all by rendering part songs and glees, and there was never a jaunt without a paste pot to affix socialist mottos and text to gateposts and stiles. Alas, as the war began to loom, threaten in Europe, that idyllic period of left-wing unity began to splinter. Ben Tillett, Bristol born and bred, leader of the Dockers Union, very quickly decided that this was a war for civilization. Ernie Bevan, his deputy, he actually stood as a Labour candidate unsuccessfully as a councillor for this ward, for St Paul's. He did oppose the war. I was quite surprised to find that in his biography, Alan Bullock's biography, that he was up on the Downs speaking against the imminent war, calling on workers throughout Europe to take action against the war. Indeed, he was a key figure in a decision by the Dockers. There was a mass meeting of Dockers 2 weeks before the war broke out, which voted for neutrality, for British neutrality during the First World War. However, once the war broke out, Bevan began to play down his opposition, at the very least play down it, and concentrated on the economic consequences for his members. The one group that remained stalwart during this period was the Independent Labour Party. In particular, they had one councillor, Walter Ailes, who remained a consistent opponent of the war throughout. And when the Bristol Council voted to give its overwhelming support for the British government when the war broke out, he was the one councillor who voted against. 40 years ago, the Bristol Trades Council was celebrating its centenary, and BBC Bristol allowed the Trades Council to make a film about its centenary. And the way it was done was that various members of the Trades Council chose a particular year of the Trades Council history and told the history from their perspective. The period 1914 to 18 was covered by Don Bateman, a printer, the president of the Bristol Trades Council, and I'm going to run a very short section of the film, 100 Years of Struggle it was called, in which Don Bateman gives his perspective. He is not a professional presenter. He's unlike Jeremy Paxman, who...
The First World War was a gigantic war.
That's okay.
Working class movements of Europe.
But one sad day, as people say, their rulers tried to shine, and the land heard the call by the River Thames, and the land heard the call by the Rhine. So these two brave sons, they took their guns and marched in martial line. But a mother sighed by the River Thames, and a mother sighed by the Rhine.
Ernest Bevan, then a member of the Bristol Trades Council, first called for a general strike against the war, but spent the next 4 years in building up his Dockers Union. Many of his members were influenced by the pro-war hysteria which was being fostered by the press, but the majority of the Trades Council opposed conscription. The council were influenced in their stand by the strong internationalist attitude of the Independent Labour Party. Arthur Dickinson was a member of both, and at the time a carter of Bristol Docks and one of Bevan's early lieutenants. What were your personal feelings as a socialist in the 1914 war?
Well, the position was that I was a Sunday school teacher at that time.
Yes.
And I felt that the New Testament taught me not to fight. So I was a conscientious objector. And whatever happened, I shouldn't have went to war. So I followed Bevan, and we used to discuss these things that are branch meetings, and very often we used to have some very strong discussions on it. But right throughout the war, I supported the conscientious objectors, and even after that, I was still a conscientious objector.
Many conscientious objectors were lodged in Hopfield prison. They were deprived of Bibles, evident that the military authorities considered the New Testament a seditious document, which would reinforce the philosophy of those opposed to pro-war propaganda.
Now, Mr. Workman, would you help Kitchener and your pal Tommy kick the Kaiser? If so, it's up to you to put in as many hours on duty at the bench as possible. Think of what Tommy Atkins is doing in the trenches, and think too that your bench is a trench. Come now, we know you are British, but show Kitchener you're British. Aye, British, right to the backbone. Douglas Brothers, Kingswood Factory.
And within 24 hours of the posters going up in the factory, the Douglas workers were all out on strike.
They took their fight with a bitter fight. Their aim was simply fine. But a mother prayed by the River Thames, and a mother prayed by the Rhine.
We were all amazed at the situation, and seeing some of the fellows that came back, we felt more than ever against the war.
But these two brave sons, they fell by their guns. Their names on tablets shine. But a mother cries by the River Thames, and a mother cries by the Rhine.
By 1916, the introduction of conscription, there was a stronger sense of opposition within Bristol, particularly through the Trades Council, who were strongly opposed to conscription. Walter Ailes proposed a motion in 1916 on the Bristol City Council advocating peace, calling for peace, condemning the massive slaughter that was happening by then, and advocating an attempt to create some kind of peace initiative. He was the only councillor to vote for that motion. By now, Ben Tillett was calling mass meetings in the Colston Hall, referring to his former comrades as canting humbugs. And there's a press report of a meeting that he addressed in which he said if these canting humbugs were in Germany, they would be put up against a wall and shot, to cries of hear, hear from the masses in the Colston Hall. Undeterred, Walter Ailes produced pamphlets, leaflets against the war, and I was delighted last week to go down to the Bristol Record Office and find one of those pamphlets. Basically, he was put on trial because he refused to accept conscription, and his address to the court after he was sentenced was then printed as a pamphlet headed "My Higher Duty to Conscience, Humanity and God." And this is what he said in the doc, and this is, of course, what it says in the pamphlet. Because horrible outrages and ghastly crimes are being committed by others, that's no reason why I too should kill and maim and destroy. And later on in the same pamphlet he says, I cannot prevent the horrors of war by helping in war. I can only help to prevent them by a refusal to war. Hate cannot be destroyed by hate. It can only be transformed by love. 41 Bristol men went to prison for refusing to be conscripted. One of them was a Whitefoot brother, and hopefully we're going to see these are the three Whitefoot brothers, all of whom made different decisions about the war. Graham decided to sign up. This photograph was taken by their father, proud of all three of them. Graham decided to sign up. Wilfred joined the non-combatant corps. refusing to carry a gun, but prepared to do ambulance duty on the front line, which he did, extremely dangerous work. And Hubert here refused to fight, not on religious grounds, but on political grounds, and was sent to Wandsworth Prison, where his son, Ron, proudly told me he organised a strike on May Day. By 1917, the war wounded were pouring into Templemead Station, and I came across a report by the artist Stanley Spencer, who was a hospital orderly at what later became Glenside Hospital. And he describes in a letter to a friend the disturbing and disquieting experience of being woken up at midnight to receive 200 wounded men moving into Glenside Hospital. In Bristol and the War was a publication supporting the war, and of course contemptuous of those who opposed to it, who were dismissed as dreamers and visionaries. And at first one imagines it had a substantial sale, but as more and more of the pages of that publication were filled with lists of the wounded and of the dead, its sales seemed to have diminished. It moved from a fortnightly to a monthly and then to a bi-monthly. And in 1917 it ceased publication altogether. By this period, of course, there were tens of thousands of soldiers dying on the Western Front and, of course, throughout the world. Two of those dead were a pair of Bristol brothers, the Jeffrey brothers. One shot by the German army, the other by the British army. Alfred Jeffreys had served with the Somerset Light Infantry, but had had a nervous breakdown, had deserted, and on November the 1st, 1916, was shot at dawn, despite the fact that his brother Arthur was killed in action. I went to look at the Roll of Honour that is held now at the Central Library in Bristol, and discovered that, in fact, there is a Jeffreys brother there, but they've got the wrong one. They've listed Alfred Jeffreys, who was one of the 344 British soldiers shot by their own side during the First World War. A few years ago, I made a documentary about some of those victims of the war. And I went to see Harry Patch, who we've already mentioned. Harry Patch fought at the horrific Battle of Passchendaele. He later actually helped to build Will's Tower at the top of Park Street. And I half expected him to be hostile to those who had deserted during the First World War. Not a bit of it. He understood only too well what drives people to crack under the stress of war, and had absolutely no bitterness towards these men. In fact, was very understanding of those who were, in the terms then, were seen as shell-shocked. Nevertheless, 344 of them were executed. I just want to run one extract from, this is towards the end of a film about Harry Patch, not about Harry Patch, about those, sorry, about...
They sing here and sing song, all the old songs. It's a long way, temporary, keep the old fires burning. They bring back bitter memories to me.
Although the names of the 344 rank-and-file soldiers executed by the British Army are not inscribed on the national war memorials. Their bodies now lie buried with the rest of the war's fatalities in the army cemeteries in France and Belgium. In death, all are equal.
Last year at the Cenotaph, shortly after the traditional commemoration, a group of ex-servicemen, veterans for peace, laid their own wreath at the Cenotaph. Every one of those soldiers, ex-soldiers, had T-shirts with the words of Harry Patch on them. War is organised murder. Thank you.
Roger, who's one of the kind of leading members, if such a thing exists, which I shouldn't say anyway. One of the people who helped get the local group remembering the real First World War together.
Yeah, I'm just going to say a very few quick things, which is more about doing stuff really and why this meeting's happened. So the Remembering the Real World War group in Bristol comes out of a kind of collaboration between Bristol Radical History Group and Stop the War. Basically, me and Jeremy met down at Council House causing trouble and then decided we were going to do something. So but the actual idea of Remembering the Real World War I comes about from about a year ago, from some meetings in London and Bristol and other places. So there's other Remembering the Real World War I groups around the country, based loosely around radical history groups or networks at the moment. So we're not the only one. There's stuff going on in London and lots of other places, and there's other groups as well, like No Glory and all this sort of stuff as well. So the point is, stuff is happening. But the point I want to make here really is I'm going to talk very briefly from a historical perspective here, because that's where we started from, being interested in radical history. But the point I want to get across is that there's no like overriding organisation which is going to solve all these problems that Cameron and Gove and all these other idiots are creating. It's us. The people sitting in this room in Bristol at the moment are going to be the people that are going to be doing something about it in the next few years, and it is a 4 or 5 year project. I would argue a 5-year project, and I'll explain that in a moment. But so it is us. So if you want to get involved, the first point before I go any further is that you need to put your email address down and some contacts. I think there's a list going around that Jeremy's got at the back there. So if you want to get involved, and that's the point I really want to make. I mean, in the Bristol Radical History Group, we always stand by sort of Raphael Samuel, if you know him, who was part of the history workshops, point about history, which is not the province of academia alone, right? They have a role in it, academics, but it's actually the province of all of us. We can all do stuff. Now I'm going to look around the room and I can see people are already doing things. So I've got German Revolution over there. I've got the Forest of Dean miners' resistance to the First World War sitting in the back there. We've obviously got people looking at war resistance in Bristol. I'm mutinies. And I'm also into shirkers, skulkers, deserters, and the people who should have been shot, right? Not just the conscientious objectors. So I'm doing mutinies, and you know, Neil didn't mention it, but obviously after the end of the so-called end of the war, which it didn't end in 1918, it carried on right the way through to 1921. But there are massive mutinies in Britain and in France by the British Army, Navy, and Air Force. 250,000 people involved in them, and that massively influenced the phase after the armistice, i.e. the intervention in Russia. So we've got a really, really interesting bit of history after the so-called end of the war in Britain. So that's what I've been working on. But there's also other stuff going on. Africa was mentioned. We've got people in our group now looking at how the land grabs in Africa, and then the kind of imperial warfare that went on in Africa prior to and during the First World War as well. There's also the issue of Commonwealth soldiers, massively important. You know, we talk about these 344 British soldiers who were shot for, you know, executed by the British Army. Well, I've already come across like literally 50 to 100 Commonwealth labourers who were shot in France after the end of the war. So, you know, there's a whole load of radical history to be looked at here, and it is not the province of academia alone, it is all of us. If you've got an interest, if you've got something that you want to look at, then you're the person that's got to go and do it and get involved with other people who might be able to help you or work with you. So there's a lot of stuff going on at the moment. But also, I don't want to that's the historical perspective of Remembering the Real World War I, which is really, again, it is up to you lot to do it. No one else is going to do it for you. And we mustn't rely on, obviously, you know, you can see already the debate seems to have fallen between Max Hastings and Niall Ferguson. Now, I wouldn't trust either of those people to have any kind of basis for looking at the First World War, but that's the way it's going to be framed. I mean, I can believe it that Niall Ferguson, if you saw him, is now the kind of left-wing opposition. So I'd say. I mean, no. So we have to do something. There's no point. If we leave it up to the media, then we're doomed, effectively. But also, there are a lot of other things going on in Remembering the Real War. So I've got a list here of stuff that I've already been looked at. Theatre, film, writing, gigs. I see somebody at the back there who does, he's trying to look away, who will be involved in putting on stuff. So radical history itself is not limited to talks or even meetings like this, but it's a whole load of other stuff. I also look at the back there and I can see somebody who's interested in football matches, which obviously have some role in our collective memory around the First World War. Schools and teaching, the interventions by school teachers to try and break this kind of paradigm around the First World War is really important. Also, there are people doing recreations. I know that Colin mentioned there, the debate between Ben Tillett and Bevan with the Dockers around, whether to stand against the First World War. Well, hopefully that's going to be recreated in those 2 weeks at the end of July this year. So we will recreate that debate on the Grove down in town near the Arnold Feeney, which is where the actual meetings of the Dockers happened. And it'd be great to have all of you there as the Dockers. So, these public events are very important if we're going to get across the message that there wasn't this kind of just rush off to the war and everybody was happy with it and there was a few conscientious objectors, because there's a bit more to it than that. Also, we don't want this activity around the First World War, this alternative history of it, to be confined to the left, or to the, as you know, a kind of, sort of ghetto of the left in the city. The point about all this is to get out there and engage in the conversations. And if that means you get a black eye, then fair enough. But that's what's got to be done. You've got to get out there and engage with the public in all of the areas of the city where you live as well. So don't think that this is going to be limited to meetings like this either. Lastly, I just want to say last couple of things really, which is that tonight, if you could put a bit of money in the box or buy a book or something, that would be useful, because it helps us put these meetings on. And I haven't got much more to say, except that's it.
Watching the films and the discussions on the speaking, the thing that hit me straight away was mothers. It was said 3 times, whether in the Ruhr or by the Thames, mothers cried, mothers sighed, and mothers prayed. From my perspective, I'm not here tonight to say I'm a left-wing man or a right-wing man. I'm not here to put a label on anybody. I don't want labels. Because as far as I'm concerned, banging on about whether the Labour Party did this, whether somebody else did that, whether the tops or the bankers did the other. When it comes to it, mothers everywhere give birth to children. And in the wars, it was mainly the sons that were affected. So why don't we start to think, instead of spending 4 or 5 years redefining how we look at the First World War history, and spending all our time trying to persuade people that there were deserters and the working class did this and that and the other. I want to fight for the working class of the future by spending 4 or 5 years to get all the mothers of the world together, starting here, maybe, if the mothers can see my point. When mothers bring up children, do they put plasters on their knees for nothing? Do they cuddle them for nothing, or feed them and put them to bed for nothing? Only to have somebody, whichever nothing is, whether it's a left-wing or a right-wing dictator or a power man, somebody that says, your son's going to put a gun in his hand, and I want you, mother, to shut up and let him kill the son of another mother somewhere. Whether it's by the Ruhr or the Thames or the Ganges, wherever it is. So that was so when it comes to it, I don't think we should spend 4 or 5 years. I don't want to be encouraged to spend 4 or 5 years redefining how the Labour Party or the workers turned on their bosses. I want to turn everybody to focus on better life for everybody, working together. That doesn't mean confrontation. That means, let's start to say, the mothers of the world are the people because the children listen to mothers. Mothers do the nurturing. And I would back every mother that there was if they stood up and said, to the governments of every country, you won't have my son. I'm in front of my son, try and take me first, and look at all these other brothers. That's it.
I wish I could say that my children listen to me, that's all. So something at the back, yes sir, yeah.
I think the point's been emphasised that it's no good us talking to ourselves about the First World War, because we know what the situation is. The point is to counter the stuff that can come out from the government and the papers and the media glorifying it to people who don't think the way we do. I'm a member of the National Union of Teachers, and if anybody was on our march today, thanks very much. We're not just fighting on pay and conditions, we're trying to begin, particularly in this area, to counter the current ideology, prevailing ideology of education. And to this end, we are talking about doing a whole series of things about the First World War, to provide resources to history teachers in schools who want to counter, you know, the given sort of narrative on it. A number of things we could do is that we could set up a website with the kind of material that was mentioned by the earlier speaker, focusing on opposition to the war, focusing on things actually like the role of women in the First World War, because the narrative is the First World War was good for women. They all went to the factories and they got the votes as a result of it. You know, but we need to actually provide material that teachers can use in the classroom to counter that narrative. So we could do that. We could support the publication of printed material that can be used in schools, can be given free to schools because they haven't got any money to pay for it. And we could call a conference of history teachers fairly soon, actually. It'd be nice if we could do it before the summer, to actually debate how the war is going to be taught in schools. The final thing we could do is sponsor a production of Oh What a Lovely War, a joint schools production of Oh What a Lovely War in this town. There's actually quite an interesting counter. It's a favourite, it's a school favourite, Oh What a Lovely War. I know it's got its faults, but it really is a school favourite. But there's actually beginning to be a bit of an attack on it. You know, we certainly don't want this Oh What a Lovely War view of the world. There's a whole raft of things that the NUT can support. And, more to the point, we've got money to put into it. Now, this hasn't gone through formally yet. I can't see any problem. We've already talked about it. But our union will do an awful lot. We've got a track record in this city of organising education discussions and debates. We've played quite a big role in countering those kings and queens and battles we have won history curriculum last year. And that's what we can do. And I think there are a whole number of history teachers, people I'm in contact already, who would be prepared to do that.
That's something that needs to be kind of tied in with a website.
Well, no, the website is a convenient way of doing it, preventing free material to schools.
As the war went on and the losses increased, the government introduced a system called the Palace Battalions, where they recruited people from the same town or village because they believed they'd fight better together. I could be a town called Accrington, which had one of the biggest Palace Battalions in the war. The Accrington Palace lasted for a week on the front line. 3rd killed, 3rd wounded, and 3rd was sent home. When I was a kid, the proportion of older women who were single in their 60s, etc., was enormous in the town. I never thought about it at the time, I only thought about it afterwards. And my granddad's conclusion from this was that patriotism was the way that rich people get poor people to die for them. And I think he was absolutely right. And it's interesting, now if you hear talk about the national interest, it always seems to be us that gets our pay cut, our benefit cut, in order for the national interest or the national debt, the profits of the rich, to be protected. But I just wanted to mention one other thing. I was listening to Thought for Today on Radio 4, not something I necessarily do very often. What was interesting was this particular person of religious persuasion was talking about the right of nations to self-determination. And he said he'd always thought this had been written by John Stuart Mill or Jeremy Paxman or something. Actually, it was a consequence of the First World War. Actually, the argument for the right of nations to self-determination was written by Lenin, as the person on Radio 4 said. And it came out of that experience that imperial powers interfering in other countries, whether it's plucky little Belgium massacring millions of people in the Congo, or any other intervention, that the duty of socialists, the duty of ordinary people like ourselves, is to oppose the intervention of our own government in other countries. But also to support those in other countries opposing their rulers interfering around the world. Whether that is in Moscow or Washington or wherever, we oppose intervention by our rulers in their interest, and we support those abroad opposing the intervention by their own rulers, whether it's by bribery or loans, as we call them these days, military intervention, bullying, or whatever else. Can I just finish by making one suggestion? Do you think it would be possible on Remembrance Day next year that after the memorial that undoubtedly happened, we try to organise a laying of a white poppy, a wreath of white poppies, supported by those who oppose all deaths in all wars, to make that point that we remember the dead our way for us, because my granddad, my father would never wear the red poppy. They would have nothing to do with British Legion. They believed that they would remember the dead of the wars their way, because they know what the bastards who sent them into battle stood for, and they refused to stand alongside them to remember the dead.
My name is Neil Max, member of Stop the War, and I wear the white poppy every November, and I agree with that comment completely. Neil, thank you very much for coming to Bristol. Welcome to Malcolm X, and welcome to the Neil Club as well. We've seen about some local people who fought in the First World War. I want to tell very briefly about another one. My grandfather, Bill Sage, 1914, was a shipbuilder in Charlie Hill shipyards in the centre of Bristol, barely a mile from where we are now. With his engineering background, he was put into the Royal Engineers. He went off, signed up, no doubt, leapfrogging down the road, as they said in Blackadder Grows Forth. Signed up, he was off to Belgium. He served in Dicky Bush and various other places. He came home. He was, after 1918, not completely unscathed. He was gassed for the rest of his life. He had a hacking cough, which I think I inherited. So the injuries of the First World War are still with us today, with my chest, which I got from my grandfather. He also had, from shrapnel, lost a finger. He only had 9 fingers and thumbs. One finger was lost. I went on to become an accountant. I'm a pretty crap accountant, probably because I learned to count on somebody who only had 9 fingers and thumbs. That's just the way it was. But it's partly in honour of him, but also the all that we're talking about tonight, that a few years ago I joined a battlefield tours holiday. And perhaps you could comment later, Neil and others, as to these tours, but I felt it was right to go. It's one of the most moving moments in my life. Stood at the Menin Gate as the Belgian Fire Brigade lay the last post. And another most moving moment is stood at the top of Tynecott Cemetery, which is just outside the village of Passchendaele. And you can barely see to the other end with all the white stone graves. And they are literally every 2 foot is another dead soldier. It's not what we want to remember at all. But sorry, I'm being overcome by it now. I think I better sit down. Thank you.
I want to go back to something that Neil mentioned briefly and said maybe he'd come back to it later, which is about how many people on the left and the trade union movement opposed the war before it started and said, like, made commitments that they were going to take action to do something about it, but then that didn't actually happen. And this kind of struck a note with me because when I was 15, I went on all the big anti-Iraq war marches, and there was like millions of people there. And yet, and then later somebody told me, like, if just a fraction of those millions of people had actually done some form of direct action, then perhaps we could have actually made much more of an effect than simply making speeches and doing symbolic demonstrations, and rather than just saying you oppose it, actually physically opposing it by blockading army barracks, by blockading arms factories, by blockading transportation links. And this is the kind of activism I have always wanted to see more of ever since then, ever since we failed to stop the war. You know, so that's, I would like to hear more about just why do people think it is that we fail to actually physically oppose war, even when we say we're against it, and why do trade union leaders and socialist party leaders sell us out so often, and why do they not call for us to take direct action? Why is it always a minority of people in the fringes calling for direct action and getting ignored often by the trade union leadership? You know, so because that's the only way. It's like not like an ideological question, it's just like a practical question. And so it's like, I want to encourage everybody to try and take direct action against militarism in all its forms. There's a group in Bristol called Bristol Against the Arms Trade, which has been involved in trying to organise various forms of direct action, which, you know, you can learn more about if you look on their website and stuff, or go to meetings. And also I'd like to just do another shout out for Stop NATO Cymru, which is a direct action campaign to try and physically prevent or disrupt NATO summit, which is happening in Newport, South Wales, just 45 minutes away from here, which is basically a massive summit of imperialist leaders to make plans with each other to invade more countries for the exact same reasons that you were saying, to open up new markets, to sell arms, to get more raw materials and all these other things that only benefit the minority of capitalists. So, yeah, that's it. I would like to hear somebody's opinions on that. Why is it so hard to get people to actually take direct action against war, despite the fact that everyone loves to make speeches against it and stuff?
Yeah, I thought that Neil's point about history being always to do with the present is a good one that needs to get made. What drove the First World War, as Neil says, is competition between rival gangs of monopoly capitalists. First we should understand that this is not a random or arbitrary hostility, but actually one which springs out of overproduction crisis. And you've got global markets glutted with products which can't be sold at a profit. This is what actually pits nations against nations, to redivide a market which is no longer functioning. What happened then happened again in the Second World War, and that's where we are now again. We are in the midst of an overproduction crisis which has been brewing for 30 years or more. It's expressing itself in wars of oppression in Afghanistan, in Iraq. It's expressing itself in proxy wars like the war being undertaken by imperialist governments to try to undermine the independent secular state of Syria. And it's being played out now also in the Ukraine, where our government and the American government have taken a leading role in cultivating a fascist coup in Kiev, and are doing their very best to convince the British public that what we're really looking at is some terrible malfeasance by Putin and the Russian forces, whereas in fact what we're seeing in Crimea is actually the rescue of a population from being under the shadow of being jackbooted. So right now, if we want to, the best way to commemorate what the First World War was really about is to start from now, is to start from understanding we are once again in a world heaving with glutted markets, in a world where the opportunities for capital to accumulate itself, to expand itself through production, are getting narrower and narrower, where there's more and more speculation to compensate, more and more areas of investment which are more and more remote from actual production of value. That is what underlies it. It's not what somebody does in the Middle East primarily, it's not what somebody does in Moscow primarily. What it is about is what happens in the finance capitals of imperialism. And if we want to oppose war, we need to understand it's going to, well, we've seen plenty of evidence the Labour Party has actually engineered genocidal wars in all of our living memory, and will do so again if they get back in, just as will the public school twats currently run the country. So, you know, our understanding needs to be, if we don't like this overproduction crisis, if we don't like the wars which it spawns, then we better do something about getting rid of terrorism, we better do something about rebuilding the revolutionary communist religion in this country. And I'd like to echo what the comrade over here says. You know, a real anti-war movement would actually be talking about stopping war production, stopping the transportation of munitions, as was done famously by the East End Dockers in the Jolly George in 1919. That's what we need to have now. Because the fact of the matter is, there's an awful lot more workers than there are capitalists. And always rely on the working class to fight their wars for them, to make their guns for them. And the day when we stop doing that is the day when they suddenly see their power evaporate. That's what we need to be working for.
Yeah, I'm a young person, and I'm probably too young to have all of this understanding of the world, but I'd also like to think that I'm too young to be polluted with cynicism. And the way I see things, I've been told by people that history repeats itself, and I've been told that happens every 80 years, maybe it does. 1929 Great Depression, 2008 recession, maybe there's some truth in that. And we look at Crimea, as my friend said, and we see things that were happening in the First World War kind of coming to light again. And that makes me wonder what the purpose of history really is. And I think it is to say, you know, lest we forget. I'm hoping you would agree with me here that the only real purpose of studying the First World War should be to stop something that dreadful happening again. And I know that it would be my generation that would probably be the ones going to war if something like that was to happen again. Only last week, one of my friends was telling me they were thinking of signing up to the army, and it really hit me hard and made me think about some of the things that I've been reading. And I think when we go talking to people, when we meet people on the street, we should be talking about things that happened, but we should constantly be linking them back, things that are happening, things that are going to happen. That should be our purpose, to influence public opinion, in fact, and to stop the slaughter happening again. And I'd like to congratulate my friend over there on what he said, direct action is probably the way forward. And I think it would be great if we, as people, could be working towards that together.
What quite fascinates me is the idea that, you know, Germany was warlike, and when you look at it, actually look at the whole the way the world was forming in the 19th century, everyone was warlike. It was part of capitalism, you know, and as Neil rightly pointed out, that what we've got to understand is the fusion of capital and the state to project power into new markets. Now, just briefly, in the 19th century, Britain had wars with the Zulus. Britain had 3 opium wars. Britain fought a war in Sudan after taking large chunks away from Egypt to conquer the Suez Canal away from the French. Its main interest was in the Middle East, when Baco was producing half the world's oil, and the Baghdad Berlin Company built a railway line, competing capitals with huge finances behind each other, were then trying to carve up the globe for themselves. And there's no wonder that these countries are now going to pitch themselves into battle as they were trying to vie for markets. If we look at the if we look where it all unfolded, by 1908 onwards, whole of Europe was spending 50% more on arms whilst people starved. We've got to understand it. This was a product of capitalism, not some rogue thing, not an anomaly, not one nation or another nation. This is the way it was going to work in order to met out who has a carve up of the globe. And even from 1908, when oil prospecting in the Middle East came unstuck by private venture, they formed the Anglo-Persian Oil Company to secure national interest into the Middle East. Churchill did a deal in 1913 to take a share of the oil. It was obvious that this whole thing was a pitched battle over capital control of the world. And we should make no bones about it. This is how capitalism functions. And this is why we oppose the war and their system.
Three more. Does anybody else going to want to speak? Four more. Anyone to five? Anyone to five? Now that's it then up. That's going to be one.
I think one of the things that this whole thing, the whole propaganda around the First World War, I mean, let's not forget that there is this massive austerity agenda which is being pushed through, and they're going to use this 4 or 5 year event to mask what is actually going on, which is going to be quite interesting because of the contradiction of you fought for the country and wasn't it wonderful, then look how great it is now, sort of thing. Message which is going to be going out, and I think it's crucial to be pointing out, the fact that what if they are banging on about how great it was, but what is the world that we've got now, which is systematically destroying all the gains that were put in place after the Second World War, is and they're pauperising people and. The massive cuts to the NHS and all these sorts of things, and it would be interesting to think about how that can be framed around what their story is going to be. So, that's good.
I just want to do a quick defence of the history thing, but not people here talking from, quite rightly, from above here, talking about capitalism and in relation to the state and all these backgrounds, very, very important, but it's also very important, I think certainly Neil made this point in the talk, that we also talk from below. The reason why we are so interested in the self-activity of working class people in Bristol and in Britain and across Europe and across the world, and the way they turned against the war, why that's important is because if you don't emphasise that, if you just talk from above all the time, or obviously capitalism's evil, I think most of us know that in this room, don't we? But what's important is to try and put power into people's hands, and that does have a relationship right now. If we recognise that, if we fail to recognise the actions of people all the way across Europe, those mutinies and those strikes and those revolutions, but also in all the everyday resistance that went on, and fraternisation, if we don't recognise that, then we're missing something. And the point is, if you do recognise that story, it's very powerful, because no one can say it couldn't have happened, because it did happen, and it did stop the war. And I think Neil's point at the end of the talk, which I've been very much interested in, is trying to feel like we had the initiative at the end of the First World War. The war wasn't stopped by the Kaiser and these fools deciding that they'd had enough or something. We'd had enough, and we stopped the war. And that's the most important point from a radical history point of view, I think, to get across in this country in the next few years, is that ordinary people in Britain had a massive role in that as well. We are not the disciplined idiots that we're made out to be. The British Army never turned. The British Army was solid. We were solid behind the British Empire. This is nonsense at the end of the war. And we've got to make that point, because otherwise, everything else out there, Germany, Russia, everything that happened in Europe, Italy, all these countries will be pushed away and say, oh, you see, they're kind of crap, aren't they? They're kind of rubbish. We beat them. And that's why Germany rolled over. It's because we're British and we beat them. And that's the kind of perspective that's going to be put forward. And we've got to say, no, that's not what happened actually. That's not what happened. There's a myth there. That's the first myth to destroy. And in order to destroy that myth, you have to come from below. That's it.
Talking about coming from below, as Neil said, and Roger, 30 years ago, a school teacher from Midsummer Norton recorded the voices of some remaining local people who have been involved in the First World War. And 20 years ago, he wrote it up into a book. And 10 years ago, we made a film, a series of 3.5 hours for HTV, based on that book. And the book was called No Thankful Village, because villages that had no war memorial were thankful villages. And there were no thankful villages between Midsummer Norton and Radstock and Bath, and that was where he sort of based his area. And so No Thankful Village became 3.5 hours for HTV, directed by Colin, called Till Boys Come Home. And that was the 3.5 hours that won an RTS award, Royal Television Society award. And the way the film was made was really interesting, because it basically a lot of the people involved in it were direct descendants from the people who were in the book, featured in the book. And the whole thing was acted out by ordinary people, no real actors, no experienced actors, apart from the lovely voice of Paul McGann, I have to say, as narrator. But we had some people from the First World War Reenactment Society, but the rest were local people acting, recreating the stories in the area in Somerset. And then, on top of that, within the local school, reproducing more of the story as a huge community play, involving probably 100 local people in this. And then woven into that as well, a lot of the people involved were interviewed about their views. So their views on what had happened in the First World War, and how they thought they would react now if they were asked to be involved in something like that, or what their views were on the First World War. Now, on May the 10th, at the Watershed, at 10:30 in the morning, that's going to be shown again, and there'll be time for discussion. So watching that, so do come if you can, and see the three programmes that will be put into one. And stay for the discussion if you can. And that's then going to be followed on by Watershed showing some of the Blackadder series, the end of Blackadder. So you can make a day of it if you like.
I just wanted to quickly say a couple of things in response to your points about direct action. And I think it would be a pity to get drawn into kind of splitting people up between who wants to do direct action and who wants to do other things. I would certainly support anybody who took direct action against warmongers or did the kind of thing you're talking about. But I think it's also very important to understand that the most effective form of direct action is strike action, because they can't fight their wars without us. And, withdrawal of our labour is fantastically important. There are examples of people taking strike action against wars and against the effects of wars, and they have been fantastically effective. For example, when ship workers refused to repair ships that were being, for Pinochet's regime in Chile after Allende was overthrown. This is something that came from the bottom up. This is people saying, no, we're just not going to do that, and very, very effective. And there were examples in 1918 that people have described where Hull dock workers refused to send munitions to the British Expeditionary Force. And again, it's fantastically effective. When the Iraq War started in 2003, there were a lot of calls for strike action as one of many forms of direct action, and it would have been a fantastically effective form of direct action. And in fact, it would have been very effective, and I think because it's now understood by Cameron and by the politicians that people would not wear an attack on Syria. It wasn't going to be possible. It wasn't something they were going to get away with. There would have been massive resistance to that it didn't happen. So I think, there's more than one kind of direct action. You mean a particular thing when you use the phrase, but I'd just like to say strikes ultimately are the most effective form of direct action. They can work, and they have to come from the bottom up. I agree. It's no use looking to trade union leaders. We have to build that sort of confidence on the ground.
Thank you. Some of us are here from the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And just in case there's anybody here who wasn't quite sure how these two things connect together, come and pick up some of our pamphlets here on the historical connection with the First World War, which is usually showed in the films portrayed as being a battle in the trenches in Europe. However, it was a golden opportunity for Britain and France to then seize the Middle East, primarily for its oil reserves, which have fueled industrial capitalism up until the present day, until it falters and runs out, and also an opportunity to enslave its people under expanding the colonial rule of France and Britain. And in an act of supreme arrogance, Britain in 1917, even before it had captured Palestine, cut a deal with the Zionists to come in and help the colonisation project of Palestine, the Balfour Declaration. My question to Neil is, I liked what you said, that this is only the beginning of a 4-year or even 5-year programme of pointing out what the real history is. And 1917, as us for Palestine campaigners, would be very significant, because the Balfour Declaration and Britain laid the foundations for the huge injustice which is still happening in Palestine today. Thank you very much.
I'm very glad to find this gathering. It's fantastic. I just want to add, so much of what's been talked about, I'm learning those and also wanting to be part of the different actions that people are suggesting, and using history to take us forward to understand better about where we might go, how we might finally start running. The Syria thing is great, and I think it's like continuing with those kinds of bits of information. But what I'd also like to find somewhere, and other people might want to join with this, is a moment of peace around the deaths of those people. And my grandfather died, he never met my dad, so I never met my granddad, etc. And we grew up with that shadow and what back then, the impact that has on families. So from that perspective, and I guess it does go back to the mother's thing to some extent, where you were talking about, but to also have a reflective moment around that, and if anyone else was interested in coming together to plan, or if it's already in place, I'd like to be pointed towards it, a sort of way in which we might have a commemoration, because I'm going to have to watch a whole load of people marching around the place, apparently paying homage to my granddad, but it won't feel like that. So that's kind of how I came to find you, is that I really would like there to be some kind of event or gathering where actually there's a peaceful moment about what happened, and not just necessarily having to fight about how we want that to impact, but just actually being still with it for a bit. So if anyone else is interested in that, I'd be interested in meeting up.
Last one. Nobody else is waiting to speak. Sorry. You're the last one then. Okay. You and then. Oh, sorry. Okay, dynamic. Go.
Okay, so when I was 5 years old, we were watching a cartoon, and then in the middle of the cartoon, the TV started flashing red and sirens would go off, and my family and I would have to go downstairs into the garage and wait for the planes to fly over as they were bombing. This was in Iran, and it was the Iran-Iraq War. At the time, as a result of that war, we had to leave and become asylum seekers here and build a life here. At the time, obviously, Saddam was a friend of the West. When I was 10 years old, we were on a demonstration against the Gulf War, because then Saddam had fallen out of favour with the West. And then when I was 23 years old, I was on a demonstration with millions of people against the war in Iraq. It's been mentioned. I just wanted to make the point there that demonstration, for me, I think, because going back to this argument about direct action, reflects for me both a personal change and also a kind of wider political change. Because in 2007, after the Iraq war had started, there was a real chance that there was going to be a war with Iran. And it leaked that the Israeli government had done military exercises and they'd asked George Bush directly for a green light. Now, I just want you to imagine if George Bush hadn't been that lamed-up president that he was at the time. If we'd removed the anti-war movement, thousands and millions of people on the streets, what would have happened at that point if George Bush wanted to go into a war with Iran? So the implications for me of something like a mass movement and protest creates the potential for so much on a personal level, but also politically. And I think it creates the conditions for direct action. I think we shouldn't be in a position where we start to constantly argue about, this is better or that's better. I think we should argue for mass protests. We should argue for direct action when it's possible, when people want it as well. We should definitely argue for strike action if we want to bring an end to war. But we shouldn't get to a position where we start to think that, we didn't stop a war because we had too many people on the streets. We should have more direct action. I don't think that's necessarily the case. As Neil said, we stopped the war with Syria. And I personally would argue we stopped the war with Iran as well.
Worried. This evening I've heard about the fact that you have a 4-year, 5-year plan. But next year, after the withdrawal of British troops from Afghanistan this year, next year will be the first time in 100 years that Britain hasn't had soldiers fighting somewhere in the world, and that worries me. I'm a mother with a son who's 22 years old, and I have to echo everything everyone said about the fact that actually it's a great thing that the fact that people protested and voiced their concerns about Syria and it didn't happen. It does seem that capitalism is in crisis and that something has to happen. I'm just worried about what it is.
Just a very brief point, because we started with mothers, and I'd just like to finish with mothers, and a mother called Alice Wheeldon, who was from Derby. Now, you might know the name, but you might not, but Google it. Alice Wheeldon was a mother, and what she did in Derby during the war, along with her sons, was ran a house for people, for young men who resisted going to war, who resisted conscription, etc., and went on the run. And Alice Wheeldon was a mother, but she also drew political conclusions about the war. She looked for reasons, for answers, for explanations for a situation, which many people did. People did in the trenches, and mothers did at home as well. And these were the conclusions that Alice Wheeldon came to, that there was a rotten system, and she had to do something as a mother and as a political being, as somebody who was able to deal with ideas. And mothers, it's not just emotional responses, people look for explanations, and they draw political conclusions, and Alice Wheeldon did that. And it also bears on direct action, because that was a form of direct action that she took. She ran a house for people who were evading conscription. And she paid a price for that direct action, because she was later put in court, sentenced and sent to jail for conspiracy to murder government minister, the Prime Minister and the rest of it, by special branch. She was fitted up, really, quite likely she was fitted up. I like to think that she actually... I don't think she'd have cried if you had been assassinated. No, I like to think that she might actually have really been guilty of that conspiracy and actually even better succeeded. Yeah. But there you go. So there was a mother, and there was a mother as an emotional being, but also as a political being. And we're political beings as well. And we look for explanations, answers, and solutions, and we draw conclusions. And that mother did that. That's all I'd like to say.
Okay, I'm going to say a couple of very quick things and then focus on sort of discussion about how you stop war. Can I first of all just draw people's attention to the No Glory pamphlet, which is on sale at the end, and that's £4 for those who haven't got it. I can tell you that it's been selling very well. I shouldn't say this because I wrote it, but I've been given to believe it's proving to be an effective campaign tool in communicating a basic argument very efficiently to a broad general audience who doesn't want to read a whole book on the First World War, but is willing perhaps to read a pamphlet about it. So just to draw your attention to the fact that that is there. And then I want to talk a little bit about how you stop wars. And in talking about how you stop wars, I'm also in a sense talking generally about how history works. Because actually when they project military power, when they go to war, we're talking about a major historical event where there are powerful vested interests at stake, in play, if you like. History often turns on decisions to go to war or not, as the case may be. This is about how history works. And let me say very, very clearly, I am in favour of direct action. Unequivocally so. And I'll tell you what the two conditions of it are. You need political clarity. And that's what was missing among the socialist and trade union leaders in 1914. And I'll tell you what the mistake was. They had confused nation and class. National interest, which means the interests of rulers. It means the interests of those people who are divided into competing groups of bankers and industrialists and generals that I was talking about earlier on. That's what national interest means. It means you line up with the rich. You line up with the corporations. You line up with your own rulers. Working people do not have a national interest. Working people have an international interest in siding with other people like themselves at the bottom of the system. We have that general interest as working people, as ordinary people, as poor people. That was the mistake that the mainstream socialists and trade union leaders made. They thought there was a national interest, which was an interest which encompassed miners and dockers and people fighting for the right to vote and so on. You need political clarity that we do not have a national interest. And when our rulers wave a national flag, we say, no, our enemy is not abroad. Our enemy is here. Our enemy is the people here at home, out to destroy the welfare state, out to privatise the National Health Service, out to drive down wages, out to drive disabled people to suicide because their benefits have been cut. The enemy is at home, not abroad. You need that political clarity, but you need something else. You need this. You need mass forces. And all of my sympathies for the young comrades in the room who are saying they want to fight. They want to fight effectively. You need mass forces. And that is how history works. And when you have mass forces, and you are in a position to challenge their wealth and their power, they will resist. And you will need mass direct action to break them. Again and again and again, when our side wins victories, it involves mass forces on our side confronting the mass violence that is represented by the system. I'm going to give you just one or two examples of this. I just want to pick up Roger's point, actually, about the length of the centenary. I agree with you completely, Roger. I'm wrong to say it's 4 years. It's even longer than 5 years, possibly, because it sort of rolls on, in a way, that great wave of revolution swept across the world right up until 1923, really, and we ought to be exploring the whole of that history. When you look at that history, what stops the war is mass direct action. What limits the ability of the imperial powers to remake the world in the way that they want to, what limits their ability to do that, is mass direct action. It's the great wave of strikes that were being talked about, the real power of workers to bring their system to a halt. It's the wave of mutinies. It's the wave of mass refusal to carry on with the killing that stops the war. If you think about Vietnam, Vietnam's another victory for our side. We stopped that war. The alliance between anti-war protesters, particularly in the United States, but to a degree in Western Europe, and the resistance of the Vietnamese on the ground, that stopped that war.
And the soldiers.
And I was just absolutely. And the point is this: the direct action flows from the logic of the struggle. What the American soldiers did as they turned against the war, it's called fragging. You chuck a fragmentation grenade into the tent of a gung-ho officer who'd just come out of West Point and was going to lead his men into the jungle. They chucked a fragmentation grenade into the tent and got rid of it. And the American boys basically stopped fighting that war. The direct action flowed out of the logic of the situation. What did it mean in the States? It meant burning draft cards. It meant mass refusal to join the draft. The direct action that broke the ability of the American leadership to continue that horrific war against the Vietnamese was about direct action. Here's my last example, and it's a particular favourite of mine, and of course Harry Patch in that bit of film that Colin showed earlier on. It was that particular song. And there's a story about that song, a little bit of local direct action, local to me, because I live in St Albans, just down the road from Luton. In 1990, it's a good example too, Roger, of this history from below that we need to explore. In 1919, they were planning to hold a big victory celebration in Luton Town Hall. The mayor had organised this event, but he didn't bother to invite the ex-servicemen, the Tommies who'd actually done the fighting. They didn't get an invitation. It was only for the bigwigs. It was only for presumably all the rich people who stayed at home making money out of the war. So what did they do? The ex-servicemen marched down to Luton Town Hall and they formed a ring around it. They ransacked it. They threw all of the, where they were planning to have their banquet, their grand banquet, all that was chucked out into the street. And then they set fire to it. And they sang, "We'll keep the home fires burning."
What's happened tonight has meant that a lot more people have become inspired and not only to find out more about what was underneath all the stuff that we've been told, but also what to do about it and how to come together to take some action about taking this forward into the next few years. So visit the bookstall over there, go on the website, which is Remembering the Real WW1, put money in Jeremy's bucket over there, so that we can continue to have events, plan your own events, link them up in with other people's events, because it's not one single group of people doing it, like somebody else said, it's everybody. So thank you all for coming, brilliant evening, thank you.